Welcome to SIMA Rama panel discussion about the documentary A World Not Ours, by Nakba Filmworks. We're so lucky today to have the film's producer, Patrick Campbell, here with us, as well as Bill Frelick. He's the director of the refugee programs at the Human Rights Watch. Many thanks to both of you for being here to help us dive into this really, truly amazing film and unique film. It gives us a perspective on life and the world inside Ain al-Helwe refugee camp in southern Lebanon, through the eyes and the lens of Mati Fleifel. So I'm gonna I'd like to introduce myself briefly and then ask each of you to introduce yourselves and give us tell us a little bit more about your work and your connection with the film, your work with refugees. My name is Jennifer Geist. I'm a teacher. I've been working in the newish field of global education for the last 15 years. And I started a consulting collaborative called Zeitgeist Creations in 2010 to help other educators to bring a more diverse and inclusive perspective on global issues into their classrooms, mostly through collaborative technologies and what I call eyes wide open media sources such as SIMA Classroom. I'm a huge fan of SIMA. I want to especially welcome teachers and students who are watching this panel discussion today. I believe there's so much to understand about the complexity of each refugee situation, and our guests today have so much to teach us about the life experiences of refugees, the social and political will necessary to make change, and where each of us fits in and can affect positive change. So with that, Patrick and Bill. Patrick, do you want to go first and take a few minutes to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Patrick Campbell. I'm the producer with Nakba Filmworks, which is a production company that myself and the director of A World Not Ours, Mati Fleifel, started back in 2010. So my journey as a producer, my career trajectory as a producer is in tandem with Nakba Filmworks. It was my first proper job as a producer, so it's been my film school in a lot of ways. And the films that we make to date have all been Mati's films. We started with A World Not Ours, which came out in 2012. And it's the story, basically it's an autobiographical story of him, his father, his grandfather, and it's a story of, it's his effort to explain life in exile or growing up in exile. He was born in Dubai and went back to Lebanon to live in Ain al-Helwe for a few years, and then his family got asylum in Denmark. So he's always grown up away from where he's from, which is Palestine, but he's never seen Palestine. So it's quite a strange disassociation that he's experienced. And his films are all an effort to explore this and try and, I guess, for himself to understand these things. So we've made a few follow-on short films, 2 documentaries, which follow people's journeys as refugees, both in Europe and then as deportees back in Lebanon. And then we've last year we released a short fiction film, which is based upon stories that we encountered while making documentaries, and that premiered in Cannes and it was nominated for a BAFTA. So yeah.
What was the name of that? The short fiction?
The short fiction piece is called A Drowning Man.
A Drowning Man.
Yeah.
And don't you have a new project that's in the works with Mahdi as well?
Yeah, so we're developing. So A Drowning Man is basically part of a larger project called Men in the Sun, which is again it's a feature-length narrative piece based on stories that we've encountered along the way. It's a very organic process. I mean, he just has friends who end up in Greece, or in one of them is actually made to the UK. So whenever he's talking to them, he just absorbs their stories, and they are dramatic in a sense. I mean, it's difficult to draw a line between exploitativeness and serving as a mouthpiece and offering the platform that your privilege affords you. But yeah, you encounter these stories, and I think Mahdi is, because of his dual perspective as a Westerner and as a refugee and as an Arab and as a Palestinian, he's in a unique position to be able to express these things in a sensitive manner. So, yeah, that's what we've been doing is gathering these stories and compiling them in a way that is both dramatically satisfying and true to these people's experience.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Bill, do you want to take a few minutes to tell us about yourself?
Sure. So my name's Bill Frelick, and I'm the director of Human Rights Watch's Refugee Rights program. I've been doing human rights-oriented work with refugees for more than 30 years. I've worked for a few different human rights organizations along the way, but I've been here for more than 13 years. And I've been in refugee camps all over the world, Asia, Africa, throughout the Middle East, Europe, Latin America, you name it, the U.S. detention centers, Guantanamo, I could go on and on, as well as many urban refugee situations. So when people think of refugees, they think of camps, but most refugees actually are living in urban environments. And of course, Ain el-Hilweh, like many of the camps in Lebanon, is kind of this sort of mix between the two. They've been there for so long that they, in some respects, are like urban refugee areas, but they are formally camps as well. And I've done work among the places where I've done my own research as a researcher, as in addition to the work that I do as directing our refugee work as a whole. I've done research in Lebanon. In fact, I was just there in January and have a report that's in our pipeline right now looking at evictions of Syrian refugees from municipalities there. I did the previous report that I did last year was on deportations of Syrian refugees from Jordan. And in both Jordan and Syria, as well as Turkey, now that I think about it, I've done a lot of interviews with Palestinian refugees from Syria, into those countries. And so that's brought me into, not Ain el-Hilweh, I haven't been there, but I've been to several of the other Palestinian camps in Lebanon. So I do have some firsthand perspectives on that, as well as just having interviewed refugees in protracted refugee situations like we saw in this film, in many places around the world.
Actually, could you explain what that means, protracted, as in?
Sure.
Just
so you have, again, I think most people, when they think about refugees, they see people on boats, they're seeing masses of people flowing across a border. And of course, that's how many refugee movements start, including the Palestinian movement of 1948, followed by this 1967. But in fact, what we often are really dealing with after the emergency, which is just, really trying to patch together a crisis and putting a roof over people's heads or a tent, water and sanitation, the situation that we're seeing right now in the Rohingya camps in Bangladesh, that's the emergency phase, trying to keep waterborne diseases from breaking out, trying to keep people fed and water and sanitation dealt with. But what most refugees really face is then this long slog where the conditions that cause them to be refugees remain unresolved year after year after year, where there are various impediments to integrating locally, where there are no offers to resettle outside of the region, and they end up being stuck basically in limbo. And what you find, especially if they're in closed camps or in situations where they just, are denied professions, where they can't have access to secondary education and that kind of thing, social dysfunction that sets in, which I think we saw very vividly in this film, where families break down, where you see violence and depression and other kinds of ways that that this really takes a toll psychologically and in many other ways on refugees themselves.
Yeah, it really is kind of I think the essential piece of this film in terms of awareness is not only just invoking is more empathy for refugees in general, but helping us understand that people live in these circumstances for we're going on 70 years here with this particular camp, which is just, I think, yeah, once it's out of the mainstream news, we forget that those people's lives and their struggle continues. I wondered if most of the audience, we're not sure how much of the audience has already seen the film. And so I want to be mindful of just setting a little bit of context for listeners. And I wonder, Patrick, could you give us a little bit more of a synopsis of the film, including how it's shot through the director's perspective, the filmmaker's perspective?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, Ain al-Helwa is a refugee camp in southern Lebanon. Mahdi's grandfather moved there when he was 16 years old, and he was from a village called Safordi in Palestine, which is now part of Israel. And his father was born there, his mother was born there, and I guess around the time his father moved to Dubai, when his parents got married, and around the time that Mahdi and his brother were born, they moved to Dubai as migrant laborers and came into contact with consumer electronics. And his father invested in a video camera, and this became a big part of his life. He also bought a video camera for his brother, Mahdi's uncle, and they used to exchange VHS tapes, just home movies, birthday parties, and his brother would send him back videos from the camp. And this was in the middle of the Lebanese Civil War, which went on for 15 years. So there was, he was showing them in the film. You see bits where he's showing them the houses in the neighborhood that have been hit by rockets, and but it's basically an exchange of everyday life. And Mahdi carried on this tradition of just filming, nearly unconsciously filming, just all the time. So it got to a point where basically Mahdi was able to film people in the camp without them really minding or being conscious that they were filmed. So it gave him the ability to have a very honest, not performance, but get a very honest picture of what people would say and do. So there was this massive archive of both his father's and his VHSs and high eights and mini DV tapes that he had. And initially he actually wanted to go and make a fiction film, which was kind of like Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. And he wanted to set it in the camp around the 1994 World Cup. Because for Mahdi, the World Cup was like the most special time to go to the camp, because although Palestine doesn't have a FIFA recognized football team, so they could never play in the World Cup, they're still all football crazy. So people in the camps will adopt a team, usually one of the better performing teams. So there's Brazilian fans, there's German fans, Italian fans. And Mahdi has very fond memories of the 1994 World Cup. So anyway, in 2010, the summer of 2010, he went back to film because it was a World Cup year, and he wanted to shoot all this research footage. While he was there, he was staying with his grandfather, who was in his 80s and was being driven mad by the local kids who were playing football in the alleyways and on the rooftop. And his friend was kind of going through a change in his life. He was part of the PLO. He was basically a soldier in the camp, and didn't want to live that life anymore. So he kind of got embroiled in this unfolding story that just happened while he was there. So there was the World Cup, there was his friend leaving the PLO, leaving Fatah, and eventually leaving the camp. And when he came back anyway with all this material, he realized that he actually had the story he wanted to tell. but in documentary form. So then we went about trying to construct it using the archive and more contemporary footage from 2010, alongside some kind of third-party archive and the music as well, which plays a really big part in the film.
That's great. Thank you so much. That's a great synopsis. It's the uniqueness of the film is that it is that I think it's was called somewhere. Someone referred to it as a memoir, mm-hmm. And him working through his feelings about being in exile, and also his wonderful memories of going back there and what in his childhood. So. I wonder, I think it's also important for the context, just briefly, I noticed the name of your film company is Nakba. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask Bill, if you could just give us a very brief, tell us what does Nakba mean, and how did this camp come to be in 1948, and how can it exist for 70 years? I did read somewhere that there is a 99-year lease on that land. And you can't help but wonder what happens in 99 years, and did they ever think it would be there for 70 years?
Yeah. Well, so Nakba's catastrophe or disaster, and that's the 1948 war, which displaced, well, now millions. Now we have, I think it's around 500,000 in Lebanon, but totally, 4+ million Palestinian refugees that are registered with UNHCR. I'm sorry, UNRWA, UNRWA. And there were. This was before I mentioned. I slipped of the tongue saying UNHCR because there's a separate agency for Palestinian refugees. They're excluded from the Refugee Convention, the 1951 Refugee Convention. They're defined under UN General Assembly resolutions, and so they've been treated legally and otherwise very differently from the other refugees of the world. And in some respects, this has complicated their situation and their lives, because resolving the situation for Palestinians is very much tied up with what's called the nationality question. So you have in other refugee situations people who have been expelled from their country or have been made to leave their country, similarly to the Palestinians, and have also not had the nationality question resolved, and yet have, on an individual basis, been integrated, have been able to go on with their lives. And so many people that consider themselves sort of existentially in their heart of hearts to be refugees no longer have refugee status and are citizens of other countries and have gone on with their lives in different ways. Whereas Palestinians have really held on to their refugee status, and other governments have kept them really in that status in many respects. And it is very much tied in with resolving the reasons for having been expelled or fled Palestine in the first place, and that as every year builds from the previous year, becomes harder and harder to resolve. So when the initial General Assembly resolutions were written in a way that pretty much presumed that people, and were actually explicitly written, that people would be returning to their homes, we see today how much more complicated that becomes, 3+ generations later, with people who still, maintain the key to their home to return to that specific place. And that, if that becomes the basis for resolving the broader nationality question, we run into these, the real issues of how do people like Mahdi, like Abu Ihad, the characters, the director and main character of this film, how do they have productive lives? How do they go on with their lives while holding out this both the hope and the articulation of the right to return? And that's a complication specifically for Palestinians that in some ways is unique to Palestinians. But on the other hand, and here's the paradox, it's absolutely the same as refugees in many, many other situations face as well. The Rohingya today are faced with very much the same issue of having been expelled from their homes, having the right to return, and yet under what circumstances can they be able to return? Can they return in safety and dignity? Can they get the restoration of rights that in the case of the Rohingya and to some degree the Palestinians as well, they never enjoyed in the first place?
So why, and why wouldn't the Lebanese government then recognize after these many generations what them as citizens with full rights in Lebanon? What would be the process for that, or what would be the possibility of that?
Well, the complications to that come from two different sources, basically. On the one hand, Palestinian leadership themselves have not advocated for local integration because they insist on the right of return.
Okay,
so
right.
basically saying, you know, we don't want to resettle Palestinian refugees to other countries, as happens in other refugee situations. We're not advocating for citizenship and integration because we want Palestinians to return to Palestine. So that's one force that has inhibited citizenship in Lebanon or other countries. The other one is Lebanon itself. Lebanon is a country with a very delicate demographic balance. It had a extremely traumatic civil war in the 1970s, of which Palestinians played a prominent role, and that balance is a balance between sectarian groups, mainly along religious lines, but not entirely. Between Shia, Sunni, Christians, and within each of those communities, they're divided and factionalized and fractionalized in various and sundry ways. And the Palestinians, I'm sorry to say, are basically caught up in many of those dynamics. And now, in addition to that, you have 1 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon, who also don't have, 80% of them, plus maybe as much as 90%, don't have legal residency status in the country. The country doesn't recognize them as refugees, and yet they represent refugees now. Lebanon has the highest per capita number of refugees of any country in the world. 1 out of 4 people in the country is a refugee, and it is a country that's poor. Doesn't have the natural resources that other countries in the region are blessed with, and we have also seen, of course, the population density in urban areas that you can see in the film that complicate that issue even more. That, in other words, the Palestinian refugee camps were defined in 1948 in many cases as only being in a certain area, haven't expanded, while the population of those camps has dramatically expanded during that time. So you have very significant population density in the Palestine refugee camps in particular. And that's, I have to say, been further complicated by the influx of Palestinian refugees. And another 40, 50,000 Palestinian refugees out of Syria have come in, and most of them are living in those camps as well.
Wow. Yeah. So I wonder, actually, is that, Patrick, you've been in this particular camp recently. Have you noticed a lot of change between when you were first there and what you see now, given some of the things that Bill just described?
Well, I haven't actually been there personally since 2012. So I was there, I guess the Syrian civil war had started then, but I mean, it wasn't what it is now. The outflows of refugees were not the same, and I guess people thought it would be over quite quickly. But yeah, so I mean, Maddie was back there in 2016. Yeah, in 2016 when we shot A Man Returned, the last short documentary that we made, and yeah, like there's definitely a palpable tension, because not only has there been like people have come, but the political dynamic of the Syrian civil war has influenced already tense situations inside the camp. So there were already factions who would fight each other, but then there's another political dynamic has been added to that. So it's more prone to outbursts of violence, and there's just there's far more people, and not really much more work. So the problems that go with joblessness and lack of resources have just been exacerbated.
Yeah, I think that for me, the haunting theme in the film is that stagnation of each person, and of course you feel that pressure to not give up the cause, not leave, but it leaves your potential, your dreams, everything's on hold. It's like a numbing limbo that they live in. And there's one point where Abu Ayed says, no future, no education, no work, no nothing. And your heart just sinks. What alternatives are there any alternatives for people, for Palestinians in refugee camps?
I mean, it's really difficult. Sorry, just to say, on a human level, the way you're brought up and the expectations that you have growing up, it kind of leaves you ill prepared for, even if you do manage to get out. I mean, just being able to function in the way that you're expected. Like if you were to come to somewhere like Europe or North America, the way you're expected to interact with institutions and function as a human being, and like the notion of going out and getting a job and having that get up and go. And I'm not saying they're lazy or anything like that, but it's just like if you're living in a refugee camp and you're told you can't work and your basic needs are met. I mean, there is no, like, the thing to say about Ain al-Helwa is there's not outright destitution. I mean, you can't. Your very basic needs will be met. So there's a safety net to some extent. But I mean, Abu Yad has subsequently left the camp. We managed to get him into Germany, and he decided to stay there and live a life. And unfortunately, it hasn't really turned out very well for him. He just wasn't really able to integrate, and you see that with other people who've made the same journey. It's very difficult to psychologically move from one set of expectations to another. Because you're just not prepared for that. So I think if the solution is to just empty these camps and move them to quote unquote better places, like there's a whole other network of support that you need around that to actually make it work.
Right. Bill, do you have anything you want to add to that in terms of like alternatives, options for Palestinians?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, there aren't that many because, as I said before, it is linked to final status negotiations. It's linked to a resolution of what's called the Palestinian question, basically, or has been over the generations, and we're no closer to resolution on those fundamental questions than we've ever been. And then you look at the massive influx of asylum seekers, refugees, migrants into Europe in 2015, and you basically see the backlash, the new xenophobic populist parties that have sprung up just recently in Italy, but in Hungary and in other countries in the region, and even the more liberal countries, relatively speaking, like Germany, that have taken measures to basically stop the flow of asylum seekers into Europe. A deal between the European Union and Turkey to basically keep refugees out. And while I mentioned Lebanon having the highest per capita number of refugees in the world, Turkey has in absolute numbers, Turkey has the largest number of refugees of any country in the world, including many Palestinians and Palestinians out of Syria as well. And there just aren't places for them to go. in terms of resettlement, which would be one option for some people. His family had actually, Ahmadi's family had been resettled in Denmark, which is, pretty unusual. That was very, very select, very small number of people that ever had that opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
And those resettlement numbers, particularly with the Trump administration cutting, President Obama had pledged 110,000 refugee resettlement places for this year, and President Trump cut that to 45,000 as a cap, as a maximum number, and we're projected now to maybe be resettling here in the United States somewhere in the order of 25,000. When you think of more than 60 million refugees and displaced people worldwide, that's less than a drop in the bucket, really. And so the chances for the 1.5 million refugees in Lebanon to get any of those resettlement places, and for the Palestinian refugees amongst them to get resettlement places when there's resistance to doing that from the Palestine Authority itself, is I'd have to say very unlikely. So you have to look for, other ways of muddling through. And as Patrick said, I mean, the restrictions on Palestinians in Lebanon itself are such that, many professions, in fact, just about all professions are closed to Palestinians, and they have many other restrictions. It's not just a question of citizenship, it's actually quality of life as well.
Right. Okay, we just have a few more minutes, and there's one thing that I need to. There's another very haunting piece in the film where the first Prime Minister of Israel is quoted as saying, "One day the old will die and the young will forget." And my question is that coming true for Palestinians? Is moving away mean giving up right to return? And is there a shift now that we are several generations in?
Boy, I don't know if I can really answer that question for Palestinians. I think, you'd have to ask each person about that. Abu Yad in the film has one answer to that, and others would have very different ones. I mean, the film, focused on that one person, which I think is, very effective for a film to do. Whether he's representative, of others or not, it's hard to say. And what people will articulate to a human rights activist like myself or to a filmmaker might be different than what they would say, privately with their family or what have you. So it's really, I think, is very much, I think, it's a question to be answered on three levels. One is the political level, sort of historical political level of what you can achieve politically and what you hold out for politically as your right. And then, that connected to that is the legal question of what are your legal rights, either in Lebanon or as a right to return, which is, is that an enforceable right is the other question. Mm-hmm. But then finally, and in some ways, not to be dismissed, is the personal question. The personal quality of your life and the life of your children. And, can you live in dignity like this? Can you go on like this? Or is there an alternative that would allow you to live in dignity here and now, without necessarily having the fulfillment of your rights, your nationality rights, but finding on an individual basis, perhaps a way of finding some degree of dignity in the way that you can live your life and life for your children through education, through meaningful work, and other ways of being able to just fulfill yourself as a human being. Right.
Patrick, did you have a reaction to that question? I know it's a real difficult question.
It's a real difficult question, and like Bill said, none of us are Palestinians, so we can't really answer it from that perspective. But I guess to add to the three kind of categories that were just given there. There's also just a very philosophical question of what is Palestine anymore. I mean, like, if you're talking about like Mahdi, he has been to Palestine. He visited Jerusalem and various the Negev Desert and bits of Palestine with the Zionist group in his high school in Denmark, which is kind of a bizarre sequence of events. But yeah, I mean, Palestine. Like, what is Palestine, and what are you returning to if you go back? I mean, I think the prospect of, like Bill was saying, the people still have keys to their house in 48 Palestine, and those houses probably don't exist, and if they do, the locks have certainly been changed. So, you know, where are you going to return to? What sort of settlement is going to actually satisfy everyone in that? Because I mean, it's very kind of extreme fringe of Palestinians nowadays. They would say we want all the people who came into what is now Israel after a certain date to be thrown out, because they also have a legacy there now. And you know, there was an existing Jewish population there for like thousands of years, and they have a right. So it's a very complicated thing to resolve, and you know, that's why we didn't really go into that in the film, because it's just, that's not what the film is about, and it's a completely it's a minefield. But yeah, on a philosophical level, you have to ask yourself, what is Palestine? Where are you going back to? And has it become something else? Has it become like a mobile identity that you can carry with you? And the diaspora, like in Europe and the US and South America, in everywhere that exists, has a very strong identity and a cohesiveness in a certain level. So that community has not been destroyed. So that Ben Gurion quote, I mean, I don't think they have forgotten, but what they remember has changed through the years and the decades.
As memory is, it's one of the things I so appreciate about this film, is that it documents now, and also the perspective of 3 generations. It makes it so special to have this film for anyone interested in learning more about the situation. It's just a really unique and important perspective that the film brings. I want to close, but I want to try to end on illuminating any pockets of hope. And the reason I work in education and I work with young people is because what we're seeing happening right now in the United States with the youth movement against gun violence, and there's so much hope in young people. It's just intrinsic to young people, I think. And I wonder if either of you could tell us as viewers of the film what we can do to support youth in the camp. What is happening with youth, and what we could do to support them. That's really how I'd like to end.
Okay, well, I'll start with the dark cloud, which is that the Trump administration has cut its contributions to UNRWA, UNRWA, the UN agency that is mandated to provide for education for Palestinian children and for health clinics and so on and so forth. And so my recommendation to viewers of the film and to young people who may be viewing the film is to advocate to restore that money. If you really want to help children in the camps, the place to help is their schools, and their schools are being cut in serious ways. The U.S. has been the biggest donor to UNRWA, and the biggest donor is now, I think, well, I don't want to give you numbers off the top of my head, but there was just a press release from UNRWA that came out a day or two ago, or a statement saying that the donations that have come in are just a pittance of what their budget requires for them to pay school teachers, for them to keep the schools running, and for them to be providing the basic education to those children. So that's really the essential question, and I think it really needs some, with all the many things to advocate on, and there are many competing imperatives really that we face, and that children and students here face. Oftentimes, because of the crisis situation, and because what makes the headlines is what garners our attention, we lose track of protracted situations that really erode people's souls over time. And I think as much as we do need to respond to the crisis situations, paying some attention to these protracted situations is equally important. And I would just recommend that as students are doing advocacy on on school shootings or whatever it may be, that actually is getting a lot of attention, to actually spend some of their time on questions and problems that are getting very little attention, because there, a little bit of advocacy can go a really long way, because it's not expected. And you can really put some energy into this and make a difference, and alert members of Congress that this is something that you care about, and relatively speaking, you might be able to have more impact on those situations. Okay,
great. That's great. That's really good advice. And I do hope that students and anyone watching this film will consider making a call to their congressman, among the many others, as you said, that are necessary. Patrick, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, on a human level, it's just to remember that all these people are human beings, and they have the same hopes and dreams as you. I mean, they care about their families. It's very easy to see refugees as a monolithic thing, and to see them represented as a threat, and see them represented as numbers, or as some sort of a sword or a horde coming to invade your country. But I mean, the fact is, with most refugees, that they don't want to be in your country either. They want to be back home and just live a normal life. So I think to remember that these are other human beings who have the same feelings as you, and when you're talking about them, or if you're dealing with elected officials or anything like that, to ask them to treat them with the same dignity that you would expect of yourself.
Excellent. Oh, thank you so much for those words. It's really, the word human dignity just can't be spoken enough, those words right now. We have to hold close to that sort of universal value. Well, I want to thank you both so much for being here. This is, I could go on for on and on. I have so many more questions, and SIMA does have a way to do follow-up questions and to keep this dialogue going. So this is really just the beginning of this particular conversation that's been going on for, frankly, far too long. But really, thank you so much for your work in the world, and for being with us today to help us understand.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. If you haven't seen the documentary already, you can watch it until the end of the month on simarama.club, where you can also take action, take the action of the month if you want to learn more about the issue and organizations that work to solve it. There are good resources on Simarama. So I hope this will also be an opportunity for all viewers to look more closely at what's happening in refugee situations across the world, the crisis, and both what Bill called the protracted situations that are illuminated in this film. Thank you so much.